What's up, music producers? In this Q&A, I give away tons of great tips that I think will be helpful for you guys. I go over how to EQ a muddy mix. I go over how to EQ the sides of the stereo field as well as the mid of the stereo field. I go over what you need to consider when bouncing down stems, as well as going over if mixing in headphones translates onto monitors. Don't miss out on this Q&A, guys.
Nee asks, how do you manage a mix with especially so many things going on in the high end of the spectrum? So when it comes to the high end of the spectrum, I like to keep it pretty simple. I like to have only a few elements that provide this high end information. And one trick that I like to use on pretty much all my tracks to clear up the high end just a little bit, and this kind of can be applied to any track that you do. I find it works really well with electronic music, but I would experiment with this with other types of music as well, is I like to cut all my instruments at 17,000 kilohertz or 18,000 kilohertz. That is, high cut those instruments except the hi-hats, the vocals, and the effects. So I'm cutting out all the really high-end information of the other instruments that don't have a lot of high-end. So the vocals, the hi-hats, and the effects are really shining through in that 17,000 kilohertz to 20,000 kilohertz range. It's a very small range. It's only 3,000 kilohertz, and it's in the upper range, so it's not quite as, the human hearing, depending, maybe how old you are. As we get older, it's harder to hear those really high frequencies. So it's not a huge difference, but it does make a difference in the mix, and it lets those instruments, the vocals, the hi-hats, and the effects come through a little bit more, and it also clears up headroom. So that's one way I like to start mixing my high end. And another way I like to mix my high end is just pick dedicated instruments that have that high end. So when we're talking about high end, maybe about 5,000 kilohertz and up, that's around 5,000 kilohertz to 20,000 kilohertz, maybe a little bit higher, maybe like 7,000 kilohertz. That's really where a high end starts. And I like to just have a few elements up there. Really understand what elements you want to have that weight in that high end, and just stick to that. That's how I like to go about mixing them. So I would EQ a lot of high end in other instruments. So if I'm layering synths and I want to have a really bright synth, and I'm layering synths, I'll pick one layer to have that real high end, and I'll usually boost the frequencies in the high end of this synth, and I will cut the other frequencies, the high frequencies, away from the other instruments. It's all about finding what elements you want the listener to hear the most of. There's only so much space in your mix in specific frequency ranges for you to have sounds. So if you have 4 different layers of high-end synths that have their prominent frequencies in the high end of, let's say, 10,000 kilohertz, if you have 4 layers stacked on top of each other, then you're going to have a muddy mix. It's going to be too bright, too brittle. So pick a specific sound that you want the listener to hear, and EQ your other sounds around that sound. Everyone thinks that to get a fat mix, you need to layer a bunch of sounds and have them all be as fat as possible. That's really not the case. It's about just filling out this frequency spectrum evenly and not having conflicting frequencies. Conflicting frequencies will muddy up your mix. So really, a key to getting a big fat mix is a lot of layering and a lot of subtractive EQing. So everyone thinks that you need to boost, 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 when you should be thinking cut, 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 or subtractive EQ, subtractive EQ. That's how I like to go about really any range for that matter. So it's not just the high end. So I'll have my mid range. My mid range will synths will have a lot of mid range weight to them, and I'll choose one element that I want listeners to hear, what provides this weight that I want, and cut away the other instruments in that frequency range. Cut away frequencies from those instruments to let that one shine through. That's Really, yeah, so it's really for every single part of the frequency spectrum that I will put that technique on. Overall, how I like to EQ to get, separation and EQ out mud and make sure no frequencies build up is I like to, once again, find the sound that I want the listener to hear that carries the weight in that specific part of the frequency range. Find out what frequencies those are. Just do some EQ sweeping and find out what really sounds bright and gives that power. And then take that frequency range that you have and EQ that exact number out in the other instruments that are conflicting in that range, or other instruments that may sound like they're conflicting. Just solo your sounds, listen to them one by one, and find out what other synths or instruments conflict with that. And then cut away the specific frequency that gives that power and weight in the synth that you want the listener to hear. Cut that away, and at the same time, I would also put a little bit of a boost on the instrument that I want people to hear on that prominent part, on those prominent frequencies that I want the listener to hear. So if it was at 8,000 kilohertz on my lead synth, that's the synth that I want listeners to hear. I would cut away other 8,000 kilohertz frequencies in other synths or any other instrument that conflicts in that range that has high-end information. So I'd cut away at 8,000 kilohertz, and I would boost about 1 decibel or so on that lead synth that I want listeners to hear at the 8,000 kilohertz. So I'm boosting the prominent frequencies just a little bit and cutting away the other frequencies and other sounds, so it creates even more separation in your track and really gives the instruments the space that they need in order to give a fat mix and separated mix and a professional 3-dimensional mix. So how do you mix the high end in the sides of the stereo field and in the mid of the stereo field? Now it's important to remember that high-end frequencies are directional, meaning our ears can perceive high-end frequencies in space. We can just perceive where they are a lot more accurately than low-end frequencies. So if you think about your monitors, your speakers that you have in your studio or your room or wherever, think about the tweeters. You have the tweeters directed right at your ears. That's where you want to have the most accurate monitoring signal coming at your ears. If you move slightly to the left, move slightly to the right, you'll notice a difference, especially in the high end. It'll start to lose its clarity. It'll start to sound a little bit duller. And those are high frequencies, as once again they are directional, so we can perceive them a lot more accurately in space. So what does this mean for our mix? Well, that means that stereo spreading our high frequencies, we can create a wider mix with high frequencies, as the ear will perceive them once again in space a little bit better than lower end frequencies. So if you had a sub in your room, say like that, and you were moving it around a little bit, it would be harder to hear where it's coming from. Unlike if you moved your monitors around, you would easily be able to tell, as there would be high frequency differences. So back to our mix. It's important to spread the high frequencies, have side information with the high frequencies, and this will create that wide mix, as we can accurately tell where they are in the mix, and we can tell that they're stereo spread, therefore creating a wider perception in our minds, in our ears, in our ears. So it can also, and going back to kind of having a bunch of clashing frequencies within the side of the mix. It's really the same thing. It's really knowing what instruments you want to have that side information in the high end. Knowing, okay, this is going to provide the weight in the high end on the sides of the stereo field, and I need to cut away other instruments in the side high end. So mid-side EQing really comes in handy here. Most DAWs will have a mid-side EQ as a stock plugin, so you can get right into the mid-side EQing. And yeah, it's really finding out what information you want in the side the listeners to hear. Leads work really well having that side information. Vocals work well, effects, really the high frequencies, the hi-hats. So stereo spreading those instruments is a good idea. You know, finding out what works for your track specifically, what to stereo spread. But those high-end frequency elements, you want to have those more stereo spread, as they are high-end frequency centric and will create a greater perception of width in your mix. So that's how I like to go about that. And as far as kind of the mid of the stereo field, you know, that's where I like to have most of my weight. Most of the mid, low mid, and mono or sub information. That's where I like to have most of that weight, as mono is power. The sides is width. Mono is power. Mono or mid. Mid is the same as mono. So I like to have those instruments not necessarily be mono. I like to have side information with mid-range frequencies also. So I'll have, you know, 200 to 500 hertz in the sides of my stereo field from like my bass element or a pad. So it's not like I'm cutting away and making everything mono. It's I'm more reducing the amount of elements that I have in the side of my stereo field. I do like to have mid to low mid information in there, as it does also provide weight. A lot of producers, engineers will tell you, oh, cut away those frequencies on the side, cut away those 200 to 500, but I have found that they provide a lot of weight to your mix and create a more three-dimensional mix than just cutting away those frequencies. It can get out of hand quickly in the 200 to 500 hertz range, really in the sides of the stereo field. So you'll have to be careful and choose specifically what instruments you want to have that weight. But I like to have a little weight there, so it's not like I'm only having everything in mono and my hi-hats are the only thing that are stereo spread. So I keep that in mind. So really the theme here is just picking what instruments you want to come through in the particular parts of the frequency spectrum and the stereo field. Knowing which sounds will work best, and that's usually going to be your main elements, what provides the most character, what provides the most interest in your track. That's usually how you'll pick your sounds that will have this information in the sides or mono or any particular part of the stereo field or any particular part of the frequency spectrum. Bouncing stems for the first time from my home rig to take to studio. Do I need to dither it if I'm just doing stems? Also, what's the best sample rate for stems? Any tips you can offer about bouncing stems or taking to a higher end studio would be awesome too. So I don't worry about dithering. I really feel like dithering, you know, I'm not super comfortable talking about dithering as I don't know a ton about it, but I feel like that's really for putting your mix onto CDs. So I never worry about dithering. I've never, as far as bouncing out stems, I've never worried about that. I've known plenty of producers, plenty of professional producers, they don't worry about that. So I really wouldn't worry about that. And as far as what I like to, there's the sample rate. What's the best sample rate? I'll go at 44.1 as my sample rate that I'll use, and that's standard for music. And that'll be for everything. Everything that I do, music related, will be 44.1. I'll never change that at all, really, as that's the industry standard. And you have movies, they'll be at, I believe, a 4800. That's the standard for music and movies. But for music, it's 44.1 for the sample rate, and I'll always keep this at this sample rate forever. And as far as bouncing stems for taking for a higher end studio, I would just leave headroom. That's really the only tip I would say here. Just leave headroom so you have enough to work with. Now, is this for mastering? Are you taking it to a high-end studio to do stem mastering or mixing? As still, I would just leave headroom. That, you know, when the tracks sum together, I would want them to be at around negative 4 decibels to around a negative 8 decibels. That's the headroom I would like to leave when all the stems are summed together. That's really the only criteria there that I would have for bouncing down stems. You know, if the engineer specifically asks for, you know, certain stems to be, you know, a certain volume, then I would of course listen to the engineer, as that's how he prefers to work. But I would just leave headroom. And of course, don't clip your channels. I would not clip your channels. Especially in the electronic music, some producers will clip their channels, which is okay, in my opinion. If it sounds good, it's okay. I don't mind that. A lot of times it won't sound good. It'll sound better pulled back, but sometimes it does sound better clipped. But I like to usually have none of my channels clipping. Very rarely I'll have, you know, a channel clipping. So the question is, you know, mixing with headphones and moving to studio monitors. You know, if the mix sounds good on headphones, it's going to sound good on monitors, right? I'm going to say no here, especially with headphones. With headphones will always lie to you. That's been my experience. Headphones will always lie to you, particularly in the stereo field, as well as the kind of volume of your track. You know, once again, you know, kind of thinking about it, when you have monitors, right? You have a left monitor and you have a right monitor. The left monitor is playing. You can also hear it in your right ear. Right monitor is playing. You can also hear it in your left ear. When you have headphones on, the left monitor, you can only hear it in your left ear. The right monitor, you can only hear it in your right ear. So it creates a little bit of an unnatural space. It's hard to translate exactly into studio monitors. So I have found that I'll have problems with stereo width and as well as volume, because everything is, your ears are closed off. You know, when you have, you know, your monitor's playing and you just have no, you know, headphones on, then you have more of a space that you're mixing in. More of a natural space. The headphones aren't natural. So your mix will kind of turn out a little bit differently. I'll find my volumes are off a little bit. I'll have certain elements that I thought were loud that are quiet in the mix when I go to monitors, and also the stereo spreading can seem off. Really, where I find the strength of the headphones comes in is a lot of EQing. I feel like you have more of a zoomed in image of the frequencies of the stereo field of listening to sounds. It sounds more accurate and more detailed in headphones. So I can make, at times, you know, depending on the headphones that you have, if you have really good headphones, I feel like you can make better EQing decisions at times in headphones rather than in monitors. But as far as stereo field and volume wise, it's hard to really translate well. So it's important that you get in front of monitors when mixing your tracks. That's, you know, my take on it. You know, of course you could do it well. It's not to say that this is for everyone. Someone could mix well on headphones and it could translate well. Not to say that yours won't. It's just the problems that I've been facing when I go from headphones, producing on headphones, and then going into the studio and mixing.
Thanks for checking out the Q&A, guys. I hope you got a bunch of tips that you can use in your productions right after watching this. And if you want to get your question on the live stream, all you have to do is join the Facebook live stream on the SoundShock Facebook page every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on the SoundShock Facebook page. All you have to do is just put in your question in the comments, and I'd be happy to answer it to the best of my ability and get it on this video. Until next week, everyone.